Right, we're ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in our study of 1 Corinthians this morning. And we have some ground to cover, so we may forego our questions for the most part in interest of time, and you'll see why that's the case in a moment. There are two major subjects in the chapter, and to cover any one of those would occupy most of our time, so we're kind of crunched to even do justice to either of the subjects there. So, we normally review our chapters, and I'll just quickly do that instead of asking you in the interest of time. Chapter 1 dealt with divisions and the wisdom of men. Chapter 2 dealt with the gospel is not the wisdom of men, but the wisdom of God. Chapter 3 dealt with preachers are mere ministers, and chapter 4 that they are not like the philosophers, focusing on the nature of the gospel, the nature of the recipient, and the nature of the message itself. Chapter 5 dealt with disciplining the fornicator. 6 dealt with going to law with a brother in fornication. 7 had to do with a new section now of questions they have asked Paul. And so here were some questions about marriage in chapter 7. Chapters 8 through 10 go together as a unit, dealing with questions concerning eating of meat offered unto idols. Chapter 9 dealt with liberties not used in that context. And then chapter 10, last time, take heed lest you fall. So we have a new subject now, according to our outline we've been following. Starting with chapter 7, these are questions that had been addressed to Paul, now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me. And so now we have in chapter 11 two subjects, point C and D on the outline here, and that is the covering and the abuse of the Lord's Supper. So those are the two subjects that are dealt with here, and either of those are subjects that we need to spend a little time with. Now, what would be question number 1? We will give attention to that, a summary of chapter 11. What'd you put? Head covering and the abuse of the Lord's Supper. The chapter is dealing with woman's subjection to man, and that's really the subject of verses 2 through 16. We say 2 through 16 because we dealt with chapter 11 and verse 1 in our last study, and the proper observance of the Lord's Supper. So I'm learning something about subjection. I'm learning something about the Lord's Supper, the proper use of the Lord's Supper, the proper observance of the Lord's Supper from this chapter. So let's talk about what we see in the chapter. I want to introduce the chapter itself and then come back to, I want to talk about some overview of the covering issue. And then I want to, we'll come back and work our way through verse by verse of 2 through 16. The chapter deals with two things here, the head covering, or we might better label that headship or subjection, verses 2 through 16. And then there is the abuse of the Lord's Supper, 16, actually that should be 17, I don't know why I didn't catch that, through verse 34. So we have 2 to 16 and 17 to 34. Now, in the matter, we're going to come back to this, so don't worry about copying this down. We'll come back to this in a moment. That under the covering, he talks about the order of headship first, and then really the rest of the chapter deals with how you show that subjection to that headship. And we'll talk about that as we go further. Now, let's talk about the order of headship found in verses 2 and 3. In verse 2, he commends them for doing what? Before he even begins to list headship. He praises them. Now that's interesting that he praises them at verse 2, and then at verse 17 when he shifts subjects, he doesn't praise them. But what does he praise them for? I praise you, the remembered him in all things, and keep the traditions that I have delivered to you. Now traditions are, the term tradition could be used in a number of ways, but I take it here in the same sense of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, to have that which has been handed down from the apostles. Now, we'll talk about custom in a moment. Obviously, we have to talk about that no matter what position you take on 1 Corinthians 11. We've got to grapple with custom at verse 16. But I'm not convinced that verse 1 is talking about custom, but talking about that which has been handed down, that is the revelation from the apostles. That he commends them for following the traditions of the apostles, that is that which has been handed down, following the direction of God, in other words. Now, at verse 3 talks about the order of headship. What is that order of headship? All right, very good. So we have God having authority over Christ, Christ having authority over man, man having authority over the woman. Now, if woman thinks that that means she's somehow inferior because she submits to someone, then to be parallel, we'd have to say Christ is inferior to the Father. Is he inferior to the Father? Not at all. He's equal to the Father, Philippians 2. Now, let's talk about the word head, and I don't want to focus just on this because this is not really our purpose. It has been argued that the word head means source or derivation. That is, that man is the source of the woman. The woman is taken from the side of man, and that man is the source of the woman. Doesn't have to do with authority. Well, if that's the case, then Christ is the head, God is head of Christ, which means he's the source of Christ, which would make Christ a created being, and that's not true. So it's not talking about source, it's talking about authority and leadership. And so as the Father had authority over the Son has authority over man, man has authority over woman. That's the point I want us to see. Now, with that in mind, before we begin at verse 4, let's agree on some things. The subject of the covering, as we're going to obviously see, if this is your first run through 1 Corinthians 11, and you've never studied this before, and I can't imagine having a head so buried that you don't realize that is a subject of controversy among brethren. But it is a controversial text. It's a controversial subject. It is a difficult text, and I'll point out some of the difficulties as we go on. But let's talk about where brethren can agree on 1 Corinthians 11, that the subject of the text is headship. While my outline reflects, it talks about the covering, really the subject matter is not so much the covering, the subject matter is headship. Would you agree? And all of us agree on headship. That is, I don't think generally among brethren that we disagree. Well, I think really the woman is head over the man. That's not our area of disagreement. So we all agree in the order of headship. Secondly, how the woman shows submission to her head, that is the man, is by wearing the covering. And we all agree with that. No matter what position you take, as per this text, that's how, in this context, she showed her submission was by wearing the covering. Now, maybe you think the covering is this, and someone else think it's that, and we'll talk about the different views of what the covering is. You may think it was only binding because of custom, or you may think it's binding for all time, but we all agree on those two principles. That is, the subject is headship, number one, and the woman shows her submission to her head by wearing the covering. But there are questions and areas of disagreements. So, what are we talking about? Well, let me talk about different positions with reference, and there may be more, but here are two basic views divided into two basic views. There is the position and the idea that 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16, is binding today. And the idea is that it was law then and it's law now, and the covering that is to be worn is an artificial covering, something in addition to her hair. That's what we mean by artificial. The hair would be natural. And so there, in some places in the country that I hold a lot of meetings, Jim Deason is here, he holds a lot of meetings in those areas where you go and most of the women in the congregation are wearing a covering. All right? That's because they believe it's binding now, binding then, and wearing the artificial covering. There is another view about binding now. It was law then and it's law now, but the view is the hair is the only covering mentioned in the context. There is no artificial covering, they think. And so they think, yes, she is to be covered, but her hair is her covering. And so that she is to be covered with her hair. And so she is to have long enough hair she covers her head. On the other side, there are brethren who think that it is not binding today, but they don't all agree, just like they don't all agree on that side. Some think it's not binding today because of spiritual gifts. Verse 4 mentions praying and prophesying being a spiritual gift. That would mean then that if spiritual gifts have ceased, and they have, we're going to see that in chapters 12, 13, and 14, then she is not praying and prophesying now, so it doesn't apply now. I don't agree with that, but there are many who hold to that view. And I can name some very prominent names, and you'd recognize those names on all of these positions, by the way. The other view that's mentioned here is it's binding for some but not all because it was a matter of a local custom. And that is, it was bound upon those to whom Paul was writing because that was the custom of showing submission. But that's not the custom for all churches of that first century, nor is it the custom of our day and time. Now, I happen to hold the latter of those at the bottom over here on this side, but we want to talk about some difficulties now. There are many issues that still are not addressed. And so when someone thinks this is an easy issue, here's some of the questions that have to be answered. Number one, does it apply today or not? And if it does, then which one of those views do we take? That's hard enough. Here's another question, and that is, when does it apply? Does it apply only in the assembly? Or does it apply at all times? And if you say, well, it doesn't apply today, let's go back to that question. Why does it not apply? Is it because of spiritual gifts or custom? Another question is, what is to be worn? Is it the artificial covering or is it an artificial covering? Those questions have to be answered. And another question is, how much is to be covered? Is it just the top of the head or is it to hang down from the head so that the head is covered? And some even argue the face is to be covered as well. I'm just trying to suggest to you that this is a difficult issue. There's some difficulties. Now, I want to add this point before we go any further. This is an area where there needs to be peace and harmony. Why would I say that? Verse 16 would be one. This should not be made a test of fellowship. At least from the position that I take, and I assume because very few, we have people who wear the covering, but we have very few that do that, so I'm assuming that most believe that it's not binding today. So with that in mind, from our point of view, and let me just speak from my point of view, I don't think it should be made a test of fellowship because if my position be correct, let's just assume that for argument's sake, and some woman is wearing a covering, is she doing anything wrong? No. And that's why I can fellowship those who believe the covering to be binding and who may even teach that, because if he were to convince every woman in the congregation to wear the covering, I might have a little issue with that, but he hasn't caused anybody to commit sin, has he? I wouldn't have a problem.
I have a question that the way I understand it is if whichever way you believe, you do the way that you believe, because if you're forced to do it, then I think you're sinning. It's whichever way you believe, don't violate your conscience on the issue. It's how, because if you believe God tells you to do something, you do it, you know, I don't think you're sinning.
Right.
But if God tells you to do something, you don't do it, then you're sinning.
Right. I want to come back to that. Hang on to that just for thought. Good thought. Good thought. I want to come back to that. Do you see my point about a test of fellowship? Now, those who believe it is binding and it is a matter of law, how can they fellowship me? And my answer to that is, that's their problem. I don't mean to be flippant about that. That's their problem. Because I've asked them that I can fellowship you, but I'm not sure how you can fellowship me. And I don't get a clear answer at times when I ask that. But that's okay, because that's not my problem. That's his problem. And so I'm going to leave it in his court. I'm going to leave the ball in his court. Let him wrestle with that question of how he can fellowship me. I don't think it should be a test of fellowship. So let's be clear. Every time I've taught on the covering, I want to make this clear. We're not saying that a woman should not wear the covering. When I get through, and I'm going to show you reasons I think it's a matter of custom, be that as it may, I'm not saying a woman should not wear the covering, nor am I saying the woman who wears the covering should quit it and take it off. In fact, I would urge her, and this is where I want to get back to what Tim was saying, that if she says, I really believe in my heart that I ought to wear it, then I tell her, you ought to wear it. Don't violate your conscience. I would even help her wear it. If she said, I don't have a covering, can you help me find one so I can worship today? Yeah, I'll help. Let's find something you can cover your head with. I would help her do that. If she come to my house and she said, let's pray, but before we pray, I need a covering. I don't have one. I'll go find something for her to cover her head. I don't think it's binding, but I would help her do that. Make sense? I want her not to violate her conscience. And she should follow that. Now, I want to suggest you need to study all sides carefully. But before I come back to that, I want to talk about who really makes it a test of fellowship. This is kind of an issue that maybe I shouldn't make a point of this. But quite often, those who believe it to be binding are pointed to as making it a test of fellowship when they don't. Here's what I mean by that. Those who say it's binding, there may be some who make it a test of fellowship. I'm not saying that. But generally, those who believe it to be binding will have those that have opposing views for gospel meetings. Now, there's some preachers in the audience this morning, and if I were to ask, and I'm not going to, but if I were to ask, name me some guys who are well known for holding the covering position, they would be men that were my friends. Carol Sutton, Hiram Hutto, Wendell Weiser, Dick Ward. I was friends with all of those, and then a host of others. Do you know I've held meetings where every one of those guys are, been in their homes, and they did not make that a test of fellowship. I want to look at the flip side of that. Those who say it's not binding oftentimes do make it a test of fellowship. How so? Because I know of places where those names have come up for meetings and people have refused to have those men or any man that holds that view. Well, why? Because he holds to the covering issue. We just made it a test of fellowship. We're the ones that often make it a test of fellowship, not those fellows. And that's an important point, I think, to make. Now, I want to, if you write this down, I want you, if you're saying, I'd like to study this further, there was a booklet put together a few years ago by Hiram Hutto, who was a good friend of mine. I agree with Jim Needham here, but Hiram was a closer friend. And I think he was a good friend of yours too, wasn't he, Jim? Hiram was a good man, but he held the covering to be binding. But he had an exchange, really just two basic articles. It wasn't really a debate. But that's in Searching the Scriptures in October. That's available online. I would encourage you to go read that. That was put in booklet form. The booklet's out of print. But go to the website. That's my website, searchingthescriptures.com. And download that, print it, use it for what you want. There was a whole special issue of the magazine concerning the covering. And Hiram Hutto well represented his view, and James Needham well represented that view. And I would encourage you to go take a look at that. Now, with that in mind, I know I'm occupying the time and not giving you a chance to talk, but if I give you a chance to talk, I don't have the time. All right. I want to list these reasons right here because this is a delicate issue, and I want to be fair, and that's what I'm trying my best to be fair to those who may believe the covering to be binding. So, here's another side point before we get to the text itself. Quite often when someone holds the covering to be binding, when they're asked what they believe and they state what they believe, people are offended saying, do you know he believes it's a sin not to wear the covering? What'd you expect him to say? What'd you expect? Yeah, he said that. And so if he was teaching the class, I'd expect him to teach that. I'm teaching the class, so I'm going to show you why I think it's a matter of custom. If you disagree, have at it. I'm not going to argue with you over that. I'm just grappling with the text. So let me list some reasons why I think it's a matter of custom. Verse 2, let's start with verse 2. Paul commends them for keeping apostolic traditions. There was a problem, obviously beginning at verse 4, there is a problem of not covering their heads. That's obvious. Everyone, I think, agrees with that. There was a problem of some not covering their heads as they should, the women.
I'm a good point of that. Are we sure it's a problem of them not covering their heads or a problem of them uncovering their heads? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. Hang on. But be as it may, the head was not being covered. That's the point. There is a problem of, at some point, their head is not being covered. Now, it seems strange to me to commend them for following divine law if he was stating divine law for all times. It seems that they were following divine law, but they're not following the custom as they should. Make sense? Seems strange to me that I commend you for following the tradition of the apostles and then turn around and seemingly state 4 to 7 there was a problem of not covering their head as they should or not keeping it covered. Now, I'll come back to that question that Melissa asked in just a moment. Verses 4 through 7. The covering was a sign or a symbol of subjection. And it's not a symbol or a sign of objection now. Now, when you start seeing some problems and holes in this position, I don't know of a position, one, that doesn't have some problems that you have to grapple with. That's true in any position you take on any question, that here's a consequence you've got to grapple with. And I've got some questions even with this position, but I have questions with other positions as well. But verses 4 through 7, it was a sign or a symbol of subjection. By her wearing her head, she was showing subjection. That's not true in our society, nor has it been true for many years. Verse 13, this is not a strong point, but I think it's worth considering in light of verse 16. The word comely, King James, or proper, New King James, means fitting. It can mean fitting in the sense it's the divine revelation. I've got that. I understand that. And he's used that way. So when someone says, I found that same word over here and it's used with reference to being fitting because of divine revelation, I got it. I know that. But I'm simply suggesting it can refer to that which corresponds to what is accepted decorum of the day. You judge whether it's fitting. Now, in the context, I think that makes sense. And you say it doesn't? Okay, then reject that. It's also interesting to me, number 4, the covering is not mentioned in other passages that discuss headship and submission. And someone said it doesn't have to be. I got that too. I understand. The Bible only has to mention a thing one time in one place for it to be true. I got that, so I'm not going to argue with that. But what is interesting to me, that in this context at Corinth, he mentions headship and mentions the covering, but other places like Ephesians 5, 1 Timothy 2, 1 Peter 3, and perhaps others, the covering is not mentioned in that context. That's interesting to me. Now, would I base my whole position just on that? No. But go to number 5. I think we can establish, and time would not permit us, and you say, I'd like to see that, I'll photocopy a bunch of stuff and get it to you. But I think we can establish that the custom was for women in the first century to wear a covering as a sign of subjection. There are multiple quotations that can go in various directions. So we got to be careful when you start citing one scholar. You can cite one over here that differs a little bit, and the timing of their quotation has everything to do with our conclusions. I won't even tell you what I mean by that because I don't have time. But verse number 6, I think verse 16 is the strongest point about it being a custom, and that is that if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. That is, this is not the custom of all, but it was a custom, at least in the region of Corinth, and perhaps some beyond that. Now, let me make this point, and then we're going to move to the text. Now, I know our time is running out. Customs change, but principles do not. And what I mean by that, let's take John 13 and foot washing. Foot washing, while used to demonstrate humility, was a way of showing hospitality. We all understand that. Foot washing is never called a custom that I know of in the text. I don't know where it's mentioned. But most all of us agree, on all sides of this issue of the covering, will agree that foot washing was a custom by which you demonstrated hospitality. Hospitality stays the same. It's a principle that's eternal. Principles don't change. The custom of how you show that. So you can come to my house and I can show hospitality without washing your feet. And I believe you can show hospitality without literally washing my feet. All right? Here's another principle. Cordiality in Romans 16, greet one another with a holy kiss. Not a single one of you kissed me this morning. Let me add another point. You better not. But were we cordial? Cordiality stays the same. How we demonstrate that changes from society to society. So what if you move to a country and a community where that is the custom? What should you do? Kiss. You better believe it. Well, I think the same thing is true with 1 Corinthians 11. Now, subjection stays the same. No one disagrees that subjection is there. A woman is to be subject to man. How she demonstrates that is a matter of custom, if my understanding of the text be correct. All right. Now, let's go to the text itself. And so I realize I like to engage you more, but I'm doing the best I can with a difficult text. This is a tough text. It is a very difficult text. And when I say it's a difficult text, there are some of the greatest difficulty centers around verse 10. We'll get to that in a moment. What is the idea of authority? Even getting a clear picture of I don't know of anybody that can tell me and guarantee me I have a crystal clear picture of what the first century custom was. I don't have a crystal clear picture. And so there's some difficulty with wrestling with this text. So let's see what we have beginning at verse 4, 5, and 6. Every woman praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Prophesying, I do not think has reference to just teaching. I think it's an inspired thing, and I'm not convinced that the whole argument is based on spiritual gifts, as some have argued, but maybe it is. But when a man prays or prophesies, having his head covered, he dishonors his head. Now let's get through verse 7, and then we'll talk about this question that Melissa raised just a minute ago. We'll come back to that. Verse 5, he just gives the opposite of that, and that is a woman who prays or prophesied having her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now there's a question, is her head the reference to her physical head, or is it her head in the sense of the one who has authority over? I think it's the latter. Because the man is dishonoring his subjection. He's showing by wearing a covering, he's showing I'm in subjection to someone other than Christ. So he's dishonoring Christ. But the woman, if she's praying or prophesying with her head uncovered, she's showing she's not in subjection to her head, which is the man. Now, verse 5 says if it's a dishonor for her, that for that is the one and the same as if she were, King James says, shorn or shaven. That is, it's all the same. It's a dishonorable thing. I can provide you some quotes, which I don't have. Well, I do have them with me, but it'll take me a minute to find them. That in the first century, for a woman to go uncovered and for a woman to have her head shaven was a symbol of, number one, rebellion, and number two, of immorality. So if it was shameful for her to be shorn, that is for her to have her head shaved, it's shameful for her to have her head uncovered. Make sense? All right, look at verse 6. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn, for it's shameful for a woman to be shaved or shorn, let her be covered, for indeed she ought to cover her head, let me start over at verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he's in the image of God and the glory of God, and the woman is the glory of man. Comment on verse 8 quickly, verse 7, quickly, is simply, man and woman both are in the image of God, but I think the point here is that he is in the image and the glory of God, that he has authority. After the fall, he was given authority, Genesis 3:16, and she was to be subject to him. Makes sense? So verses 4 through 7, she shows her honor by the use of the covering. Now, I want to make this point quickly, back to what Melissa just raised a moment ago. Is this talking about the assembly? Some said, well, this is talking about in the assembly, and that's a very common view, that this is dealing with the assembly, and this only applies in the assembly. If this is talking about in the assembly, she's praying and prophesying, not listening to praying and prophesying. She's praying and prophesying. That's interesting. Yet in chapter 14, verse 34 and 35, the woman was not to speak in the assembly. So this must not be talking about the assembly, or at least not limited to the assembly. Some think this applies to the assembly, and that's where she's to be covered because she's in worship, because that's where she's praying. It seems to me, back to what Melissa said, that this was a problem not of women needing to put the covering on as they prayed or prophesied, but not to take it off as she prayed and prophesied. Make sense? Now, if my understanding of the text is correct, that it was a custom of how you showed subjection and submission, not just in the assembly, but at all times. That is, in public. And that she would wear the covering as a sign of her subjection. But because she is inspired and she was able to prophesy, or she thinks she's equal to man, she may have taken the covering off. Seems to me that's what verses 4 to 7 is talking about. So the point seems to be that not that you need to put it on when you pray and prophesy, but don't take it off when you pray and when you prophesy. Make sense? Don't take it off. There's no reason to take that off. Now let's get verse 7 through 12. He goes back to a part that all of us agree with. Even though this is a difficult section, we all agree, no matter what position you take, that woman was created in subjection to man. So let's get that quickly. That verse 8, the man did not come from the woman, nor the woman from, for the man is not from the woman, but the woman from the man. Shows her subjection and submission. Nor was man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. She was created in submission. That's the point. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. The word symbol has been supplied by translators. So here's one of the most difficult phrases in the entire chapter for me. And most commentators wrestle with this. I'm not convinced that it's saying she has a symbol of authority as much as it's saying she has authority on her head. What does that mean? I'm not sure. But it's the word for authority. It may imply the symbol of authority. Most have read the text saying it's a symbol of her subjection. But that's not what the word says. The word talks about authority. Now, because of the angels. Now, what's that about? Well, if I open that up, I'm going to get 4 different views, and I don't have time for that. And so I don't mean to be rude. I just don't have time for that. And I don't know which one of those I'd pick exactly. Many point over to Genesis 6. I'm not sure there's a connection there. I'm not convinced that we go to Genesis 6. I'm convinced it has a connection with the angels that did not keep their role of submission, Jude 6, 2 Peter 1. I'm convinced it probably has reference to that. That she is to have this authority on her head. That she is to put, maybe it is a symbol of authority as she prays and prophesies. I'm grappling with verse 6. Now, while I say I'm not going to open it up, help me out, Jim. What do I do with verse 10?
You know, I'm right where you are with regard to that. I don't really know what, I struggle. It is, July 18th today?
Yeah.
I may change my position on this passage tomorrow.
Me too. I'm wrestling with that. And nearly every commentator I read, that's when I get through with it's a brethren or some denomination, it doesn't matter. When they get through with it, I'm thinking, you're struggling too. And so that's a tough passage. It's in this context where woman is created in subjection to man. That seems to be the thrust. Now, let's go on to verse 11 and 12, and maybe this will help us a little bit. Verse 11 and 12, nevertheless, neither is the man independent of the woman, or the woman independent of the man in the Lord. For as the woman was from the man, so the man is also through the woman, but all things are of God. What am I learning from 11 and 12? They're dependent upon each other. Their subjection does not prove inferiority. That's the point. So when she shows her subjection, whether it's through the covering or obedience or submission, just that principle of submission, she is not inferior at all. She's not inferior at all. They're each dependent on each other. And so he's not the man that can make it by himself over here. He needed a helpmeet for him, etc. Now let's talk about 13 through 15 about the matter of nature. And here is again a question. Is the nature the long-established practice, or is it nature in the sense of what we naturally learn, natural order of things? I think probably the latter fits here. And I think his argument is this. Let me make the argument and then see if we find it in the text. And we're about done with our time. That even a look at nature shows you there's a distinction in men and women. Even a look at nature should tell you that the woman ought to be covered. In this sense, verse 14, nature teaches you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him. But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. I'm convinced that covering is the hair there, but there is an artificial covering mentioned at verses 4 to 7. So what's his argument? I think his argument is this, that just looking at nature, that there are exceptions. You don't see many bald women who just naturally go bald. You see men who do that. So naturally, men's hair grow, and they can grow long hair, but women grow longer hair. And as a rule, men's hair is shorter than women. That's just nature would teach you that. So that is one of the arguments that women are different from men, number one, and number two, that she ought to show her symbol of subjection. Somehow nature relates to the argument that he's making. In interest of time, let's get to verse 16, and this is as far as we're going to get. That if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom. I think he identifies it here as a custom. And so, let me wrap up with what conclusion I draw from all of that. Women are to be subject to man, number one. How she shows that, someone says, I think that means she used to wear the covering for all time. Well, then wear it by all means, please. You got to do that if that's what you think. Wear it. But if you conclude as I do that it's a matter of custom, then what that's suggesting is that we need to fit whatever the custom is in the society in which we live. What if you move to a third world country where in that tribal community, to show subjection to your husband, you always walk 3 steps behind your husband wherever you go? You better stay 3 steps behind, because that's how you show it. And now that's not true in this society, but that's true there. So she says, I want to be subject to my husband. I want to do what the Lord, I want to follow his command. God didn't command you to walk 3 steps behind, but he suggested or said you need to do that which shows that subject. Make sense? Yes, yes. Now, did I answer all your questions? I'm not even going to ask that out. But did I ask? No, I know the answer to that. I didn't answer all your questions. Did I settle it for everybody? No. I didn't even settle it for myself. I didn't even convince Jim of a different position on verse 10 back here. So anyway, that's as far as we get. Time is gone, and we didn't even cover the rest of the chapter, but that's okay. I thought it important that we address this because it's a delicate issue. All right. Chapter 12, next time we may make a brief comment about the end of chapter 11 and then go into chapter 12.